Biggest challenges are the languages and the different platforms. The UN is supposed to be communicating in at least 6 languages altogether with the help of our UN information centers, and one of them, a very important one, is here in Nairobi. We're able to communicate in as many as 53 different languages. And we try not just to translate, but to generate content in those different languages from the beginning. Because as I'm sure you know, translation is very often not a very good way of conveying information in a particular language. It's much better if it's being created from scratch. And at the same time, we're trying to communicate from radio, television, web to most, if not all, new media. Now, our bosses, if you will, are the 193 member states of the United Nations. And they have very often very different expectations in the kind of work that we are doing. There are countries belonging to the Northern Hemisphere who believe we should only focus on social media, and there are countries of the Southern Hemisphere who say no, but in our case you can reach most of our public via radio and more traditional media. And the same is true for online publications, e-books versus making publications available in print. I'm only sharing this with you because we're kind of coming now to the point where the two of us could connect and are connecting. And as we had a chance to walk through the building, you were explaining to us and colleagues were explaining to us projects that you are already doing jointly with the United Nations and different agencies of the UN. You mentioned the World Food Programme, I think, as one entity. As we are trying to make our work and our efforts known to a broader audience, we're trying to do that also via mobile applications. Some of those applications we created ourselves. We have a kind of creative team among our own colleagues. I mean, it's a very simple application, for example, depicting the individual UN days around the year, sort of celebrating different aspects or commemorating different aspects of international relations. It could be something like commemorating the atrocities linked to the genocide in Rwanda. It could be Holocaust remembrance. It could be World Water Day. And this very simple app just depicts those different days and the purposes that are underlying those days. And it encourages those who are interested to organize events around that time. That would be a very simple app. And then we would be interested, for example, also in terms of the reach of our services. Because very often we have kind of key figures, but we don't have the detailed information that we would like to know. For example, the Weibo, Sinan Weibo Chinese account has the largest following, more than 5 million followers around the world. The English language Twitter account has about 3 million, a little bit more than 3 million. Facebook has about 2.5 million followers, but we don't know enough about the demographics that lies behind it. We're having difficulty with these large numbers to actually interact with our followers, because that would require a strategic decision to shift resources away from some other services that we are providing to enable us to interact with our audiences more than we are doing right now. So these are just a couple of thoughts as an introduction.
Okay, I'm just hoping that those amongst us who are especially developers, mobile application developers, are probably just taking note of some of those gaps. And that kind of leads me into a question for you. How accessible is the data that the UN hosts or has to the general public? Because there might be opportunity where mobile application developers or just application developers might be able to, in a sense, achieve some of what you want to do as a UN by taking off that responsibility by when the data is open?
Well, the analytical tools that we are using right now are mostly open source based tools, simply because they're less cost relevant than other more probably more sophisticated tools. But we've kind of reached certain limitations with using those open source tools, and therefore would like to go beyond it. We talked a little bit about it early on. For us, it's important to break down the kind of language that we are using as UN bureaucrats. First of all, in such a way that you may be able to understand what our needs are, but also that the general public understands why what we are trying is relevant and can be relevant to them. That has sort of also an ulterior motive, because the member states have to defend in their parliaments why they should be giving money to the United Nations. And they can only do that if they can explain to someone in Tennessee that it's worthwhile that the United States pays for about 23% of the United Nations budget right now. So kind of to connect the dots, and that's something that I really liked in all the introductions we received as we were walking through the building, that whatever you're trying to do, you want to make it relevant to your consumers or to those people who eventually will be able to make use of your services. I think that is exemplary and something to be followed. Now, coming back to your questions, the data, as far as we have them, obviously we'd be happy to make them available to you, but I think we are trying to get hold of more data. For example, we create television and radio broadcast material that we offer to broadcasters and television operators around the world. We know roughly how many of them are making use of our broadcast material, but we know very little about how many of them literally then broadcast those programs or parts of it, and even less so how many people we would be able to reach through those programs. I mean, that might be something that's quite interesting, because we're putting still quite a lot of people, human resource, into creating radio. We have 60 people alone who work on radio programs in those 8 languages, including Kiswahili. So to get to the bottom of that information and to find out as to how much and how many people do we reach and what segment of societies do we reach, I think would be extremely helpful to our work.
Before I think we had a chat with about having it's kind of this session going to be a bit, if you like, relaxed, informal. So just keep thinking of questions. I think I'll open it up in about 2 minutes to just general questions, such that will form the majority of this session. But I just want your comments or your thoughts on this issue of online privacy with the whole allegations of NSA snooping on people's emails and all that. What are your thoughts on that? It's something that's very important for many people here, I think.
Well, as many of you may know, the United Nations was also at the receiving end of this so-called snooping, including the Secretary General. I remember he prepared for a particular meeting with a world leader, and the notes of his for his meeting that were being prepared for him had already been shared. So in that sense, we understand what it means. And the United Nations tries to stand for freedom of expression, freedom of media. That's a very important value. And obviously also for transparency. Now the question is where do you draw the line, and understand in this international conversation that is something that may be seen differently, but it's great being here in a country that has such a vibrant media landscape and such a creative media community, be it traditional media and newspaper all the way to social media, and with a population that is so actively participating in that discourse. and not the least on the question that you just asked me.
Incidentally, he was at Ghetto Radio earlier before coming here. So if you listen to Ghetto Radio earlier, I think you might have heard him. Anyway, I think we'll take a few questions for now, and I'll have Nekesa do that session at the moment.
So what I'm interested in is, hi, Jessica from the iHub, in charge of partnerships. And I've been in the Tech Hub ecosystem like for almost 5 years now. And from what we've seen is that the donor shift is changing, right? You deal with a couple of donors that also we deal with, like DFID and CEDA and the rest. And their shift is changing in what they're investing in. The traditional model of investing in infrastructure, they're moving more to kind of like human capacity and things like that. How do you think like tech hubs like the iHub can be part of this ecosystem and also evolve with the donors and also evolve with players like the UN and all?
In fact, this morning we were privileged to be able to participate in a kind of a presentation for journalists of the first ever UN joint program for Kenya. And capacity building, from what I understood, was one focus of that program. So I think it shows that the UN is trying to respond to needs, the need that you kind of just described. Now, in terms of donor community, in the case of the United Nations, we have to talk about two groups. One are the member states, who are kind of the traditional partners when it comes to providing funding to the UN and providing mandates. Basically, they also tell us what they're expecting us to do. And the kind of donor community that you just referred to, that are partners of the United Nations, mostly in field operations, in field missions, be it in our efforts to reduce poverty or eradicate poverty, be it in terms of eradicate deadly diseases, be it in terms of protecting women and girls from sexual violence, women empowerment, gender-related questions, be it in terms of the issue of water and sanitation. More than 2 billion people do still not have access to safe drinking water, for example, around the world. So that's where this cooperation comes in terms of the kind of partners that you refer to. Now, for all of them, I think, and all of them and us have realized, unless you provide the capacity building to individuals that represent these organizations, you will never get to where we want to get to. So in that sense, education and access to better education and access to more specialized training is essential. Now, unfortunately, since that is not the only goal and challenge that we are pursuing, it does not get the kind of resources that it deserves. Because all the other problems are also out there. And in the end, the UN, and that is, on one hand, its great asset, but at the same time, also its great advantage, it has no choice but to pursue all the problems that this world is facing. But I can assure you that I know from the Secretary General, I also know from his initiative, for example, of having appointed the first ever envoy on youth, that the focus on providing young people with better access to education and to successfully combat youth unemployment, which is a big issue and I understand is also a challenge here in Kenya. That anything that helps to enhance capacity and prepares particularly young people for the kind of job market that is available out there is very much on top of our agenda.
Thank you. So we are live streaming the session. We've tweeted the link on our @iHub Twitter account. Please feel free to retweet that. We'd like to take as many questions as possible, so I'll ask that you be quick. We'll take about 2 to 3 questions at a time. So if anyone wants to go after this gentleman, you can raise your hand now.
Thank you very much, Peter. And it's a pleasure to meet you and see you in Kenya. My question is about communication at the UN and the tools that are being used by the UN in mainly communication. Mainly, we tend to think that communication would be from the UN going down to the beneficiaries and not actually the reverse, from the beneficiaries going up to the UN system. Now, I've looked at what happens, for instance, under the WFP. I mean, it's a big global program that runs out there, trying to provide food to those that are either, in need of food, facing certain, emergencies of some sort. Now, the question that I would wish to ask to the UN is, what is the UN's solution or strategy to actually gather data moving from these beneficiaries up to the UN system? And the reason why I'm asking this is because the scenario has really changed. For instance, I'll take Kenya. It's no longer the 1990s or the year 2000. It's now post-2010. And for instance, in Kenya, out of 42 million people, 30 million of them have a phone. Literally every other Kenyan adult has a phone in our country. Meaning that when emergencies actually occur, or even when the UN is engaging in development-based program, that at least each and every adult that's going to be targeted by a UN program has somehow access to a mobile phone. And now the question is, why therefore does the UN has to insist on heavily investing, for instance, in for instance, survey programs, for instance, which rarely involve the use of a technology to the largest extent, which in our country has been heavily adopted. So what is the UN strategy to gather data from the masses going up and not only about from the UN going down? And then again, Kenya is a hub for innovation. And I believe globally there are some competition, but would the UN be willing to pose it as a challenge to Kenyan innovators to come up with a solution or a technology solution to address the gathering of data from the populations, mostly using the mobile-based platforms, pushing it up to the UN? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Well, you asked a couple of questions. First of all, in terms of communications, yes, it's too much from top down. But that also has a cultural dimension. Because, first of all, one tries to respect the individuals that we are trying to support. As we're sitting here, the UN supports 44 million refugees around the world. That means create shelter, access to food, access to safe drinking water, access to medical assistance, and access to basic education for children, very often under very difficult circumstances, war, civil war-like situations. You talked about the World Food Programme. The UN feeds every single day 90 million people in 75 countries. And that involves the entire logistics of getting food to those individuals. The UN is running 17 programs to demine areas after war or civil war-like situations. That means to clear a field of mines so that kids can walk out and play in a field without the fear of losing a limb. So we kind of talk about it because we also don't want to exploit the individuals whom we help. And it's a bit of a dilemma. The same is very often true for the country that is affected by a natural disaster. The country obviously is not always very proud that it is in such a situation or requires international help. So communicating this kind of work is quite complicated because you try to be respectful while at the same time inform and talk about the efforts that you're undertaking. Now, the second aspect of your question was related to actual data about the individuals that we help. You're right that there's a big deficiency because most of the data, if at all, would be available with the governments and the authorities of the country that is affected by a crisis. I will give you an example. During the tsunami, My then government, the Austrian government, found out via cell phone providers, roaming partners of Austrian cell phone providers, that 2,541 Austrians happened to be on holiday in those affected areas. And they were able to push out information to them, whom to contact in case of need, and where they could get some help in these very difficult circumstances, and where to call to acquire assistance. So the kind of information that pertains to the individuals, unfortunately, is most of the time not available with the UN, except for those who've already actively sought UN support, say in a refugee camp or in some other kind of environment where the UN goes to provide assistance. And the third part of the question is, would the UN seek Kenyan assistance? Yes, obviously, we are already doing that, and we would do much more, because I think we recognize there's so much creativity here and so much willingness to also cater that creativity to the actual existing needs out there, and therefore also to the UN. So I think we should sit together in the way that you probably have done with the World Food Programme, and look at the entire range of services you are able to provide, we are able and seeking to provide, and find a way to connect the two.
Okay, my name is Álvaro Gutiérrez. I am from Colombia. I was a member of rescue team in major emergencies around the world, like Colombia Armero, Mexico earthquake, Hurricane Mitch, Haiti, Banda H. And one of the biggest problems that I detect in this, I was working with communication, emergency communications. One of the biggest problems that I detected is the speed that UN, because the bureaucracy is working in all these emergencies. Media like radio, TV, web services are very important in these emergencies, but I never saw the people of UN arriving on time in this kind of thing. What we can do to increase the presence of UN in these emergencies that really is very needed. The other thing is, in case like actually Venezuela, for example. Venezuela has 1 month of strike. There are people dying because there's no any food at all in Venezuela. And UN is not mentioning nothing about that in any of the sites of a UN. Syria, UN started talking about Syria after 3 months. People was dying, people were going out of Syria, going into refugee camps. And nobody from UN in the first stage of these emergencies was doing nothing. Now, my idea is we can start working together with these kind of services of UN. Sites like iHub can do so many things. Amateur radio operators. I am amateur radio operator. And because that I am involved in all these emergencies. We was giving information from the beginning. And everybody is providing that. There's things like, for example, at this moment, if you need information about any health facility, include the GIS location of any health facility here, the Ministry of Health are not able to provide complete. But we have in Kenya a database with that. There are other issues. There's the colleague here was mentioning, every Kenyan, I tell you, every Kenyan is using a mobile, and every Kenyan can be a source of data. How we can canalize this information to arrive to UN and start providing the information in the right time.
Encantado, muchas gracias. The speed and lack of speed at the UN. Maybe in order to understand how the UN operates, if you take a step back, I mentioned UN basically is a reflection on the world as it is, and on the world consisting of 193 member states. Now, before the UN can swing into action, it requires that the 193 agree that the UN should swing into action. So unfortunately, we cannot detach our colleagues who work for the UN from the decisions that are and have to be taken by the member states who tell us, yes, we want the UN to get involved, for example, in Syria. In fact, Syria is a good example both for what works and what doesn't work. Because on one hand, Syria shows the 5 areas where the UN is the only institution worldwide that tries to alleviate the fate of millions of people. We're talking about 10 million refugees as well as internally displaced people in the country and in the 4 neighboring countries. And the UN tries to provide those refugees with food, with medical assistance, with shelter, with basic education. The UN was the institution with independent experts to ascertain the chemical weapons and is now trying to bring them out of the country in a civil war-like environment. You have to imagine that when you take an aid convoy or when you take these chemical weapons out of the country, you have to negotiate with representatives of the government and representatives of different opposition groups so that these convoys get safe passage. And sometimes you spend much more time negotiating that safe passage with the different groups than you are able to spend on actually transporting aid or these weapons out of the country. So in a war-like or civil war-like environment, that's pretty difficult. And many of our colleagues are literally risking their lives every single day. The third area is the political dialogue. It's the one that enjoyed the most limelight because initially, and you rightly mentioned that, the Security Council could not agree on a political dialogue and who would participate in that dialogue. Eventually, thank God they agreed. But then again, the institution, the UN, can only be as good and as successful as its member states allow it to be. And I think that very often brings us to the limitations. There's a fourth area. The UN is the only institution that will make sure that those responsible for the killing of the 150,000 by now people in Syria will eventually be called accountable and for what they've done. Unfortunately, it's not possible right now because for humanitarian aid, for bringing the chemical weapons out, and for negotiating an agreement, you need to talk to all sides. And that's the big dilemma of the UN. We cannot afford not to talk. As much as we disagree and as much as we hate as anyone else, that there are so many people who have blood on their hands. We don't have a choice to talk to them to help the remaining people. So that's a real dilemma. And last but not least, you may have heard that unfortunately polio resurfaced in Syria. 2.5 million kids are being vaccinated by UN colleagues, again in a warlike environment on an everyday basis. So in that sense, Syria shows all the good sides of the UN and all its limitations. Now you mentioned the example of Venezuela. I agree with you. It's horrible to see the kind of life people have to go through. But unfortunately, the UN also needs the consent of the country that is affected, be it by a natural disaster, by a war, or in this particular case, by a strike, needs this consent by the country to actually set foot on the ground of the country and provide assistance. So very often we would like to, but we are limited by the lack of willingness of our, if you will, board members, the member states. And it's a real dilemma. It's a real dilemma and sort of makes our efforts sometimes look very weak and very bland and very late in the day. I agree with you.
If you take information from the base, you are not going to, probably this information is not according with the mandate of UN or the members of UN. If I go to Venezuela at this moment, probably the opposition is not accord with the thing that the UN is doing. This is one other problem that you have. But it's possible also to have information from the source, from the field, and escalate this information in the media that you have.
That is true insofar as it would give us realistic information what is really happening, but unfortunately may not solve the challenge that we are facing as an institution to get the green light from Venezuelan authorities to come in and help their people. I mean, that was the same with Syria, as you rightly pointed out. For a long time, the Syrian authorities did not agree, and the international community did not agree either that the UN would come in and help. And that's why you had this delay that you described of 3 months. I fear it may have been even longer than that. Now, the Secretary General, I think, is taking the lead to get member states to act on situations like the one you described in Venezuela. He can only, through speaking about it publicly, put a little bit of pressure on those governments to realize what they're doing and to maybe have them change their opinions. But it does not always work. So someone told me the UN is a reflection on the world as it is, but it's one of the few organizations that keeps working every single day to bring us a little closer to the world that we would like to see. So.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Amin Dukwe. Perhaps my question will have come immediately after the gentleman, because it touches much on what you had to mention on exploitation in mining. So I hereby do ask you a question. How do you measure your involvement in protection on this exploitation? The UN involvement. The question number 2 will be, the UN is trying to bring the world closer to what we expect and what you as the UN expect in humanity. Why is it taking too long? Question number 3 will be, just one. Okay, please. I'm told that it is.
Thank you. On the issue of exploitation, see, the UN takes up these issues through public statements, and by trying to get member states to act on it. You meant exploitation specifically with regard to mining. Is that what you? Yeah. Well, I would say in general terms, if you were to follow the statements that the Secretary General makes and that other colleagues at the UN are making, for example, to human rights and related issues, and I get exploitation would fall under human rights. I think these statements are very strong. Again, one way is to generate public awareness, and through public awareness bring about change. But as you know, to generate public awareness, even with the help of social media, it takes its time, and therefore, unfortunately, is very often very late. It is not lack of willingness, but it's sort of inherent in an institution that has to try to forge a common ground among the international community. See, imagine you have a family sitting around the table of parents, father, mother, 2, 3 children, and how difficult it is for them to agree on, I don't know, where they may go for holidays or something, very simple, trivial questions. And how much more difficult it is to get member states, 193, or when it comes to the Security Council, 15, to agree on one and the same approach. In fact, it's quite remarkable how often they do agree, but it's frustrating in those areas where they can't, and where they can't quickly enough. And as you know, the United Nations really learned its lessons when it comes to Rwanda and Srebrenica in Bosnia, where lots of people got killed. And the international community basically was paralyzed because we were unable to take such a decision that would have been required. It's difficult for the UN to constantly point out the difference between individuals working for the institution and the member states. But in order to understand how it works or doesn't work, unfortunately, one will have to highlight it. I also wanted to let you know on a more upbeat note, we're working very closely with the creative community worldwide. Filmmakers, documentarians, feature films, television series are very interested to include UN messaging in their programs. I will give you an example. There's a television series called Revolution that is based on the world without power, without electricity. And the script writers of this series, of these episodes, sat together with UN experts on sustainable energy and talked about how to convey to the audience what it means to live and grow up in an environment where you can't just go to the plug and switch on your light or, I don't know, plug in your cell phone or your fridge. What does it mean for a child coming home after dark, not being able to study and doing the homework? What does it mean for food that cannot be stored in a fridge and rots in the difficult climate? So we're working with creative community to kind of raise awareness. And I get that would also be true for the issue of exploitation and mining that you have asked.
Thank you. So please allow me to move on to a couple more questions, and then we'll come back to you. No, we.
I agree with you. It's very, very frustrating. What I've tried to do is I try to explain the decision-making process that needs to be followed in order to intervene. It requires that the Security Council, for example, the 15 member states, agree on getting the UN involved, agree on sending peacekeeping forces, agree on sending humanitarian assistance. And unfortunately, this conversation among the world powers sometimes or too often takes very long. So even though the institution would be ready, the logistics are in place, the equipment is ready, we need to wait for the international community to agree that the international community is willing to help. I agree with you. It is very, very frustrating. But see, it's an institution that is driven by the views that the international community, these 193 member states, decide upon. And in a way, we are like civil servants in a ministry, say in Kenya. It requires the decision by the Kenyan government that the Kenyan resources should be put to use to people in need in a particular part of Kenya. Might be much quicker because it's just one government, but here you have 193 sitting around the table, or at least the 15 in the Security Council.